So today we are very excited to have Professor Anjali Dayal as our speaker. Anjali Dayal is an assistant professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York. Her research focuses on the relationship between international organizations and peace processes, human rights, and security. So she holds a PhD in government from Georgetown University. Today she will present her book, Incredible Commitments: How UN Peacekeeping Failures Shape Peace Processes, which just came out with Cambridge University Press. As discussant, we have our own Dr. Dana Landau, senior researcher at swisspeace. She holds a PhD from the University of Oxford, the Department of Politics and International Relations, and her research focuses on peace mediation, peace process design, as well as nationalism and minority rights. Professor Dayal, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's wonderful to be with you all. Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. I've got a presentation of about 25 or 30 minutes, and I'll try and keep it short. And please feel free to ask for any information about anything that isn't in the talk as well. There is a chapter on methods, for instance, which I don't cover in the talk because it tends not to be the thing that's most interesting to an interdisciplinary crowd, for instance. But if you have those questions, feel free to ask them. So as we just heard, this is a presentation based on my book, Incredible Commitments: How UN Peacekeeping Failures Shape Peace Processes. And the basic insight that the book starts from is one that's familiar to all of us. It's that UN peacekeeping missions are commonly authorized and commonly sort of agreed upon and sent out into the world by the UN Security Council. They are planned and staffed by the UN Secretariat, and a pretty predictable group of countries deploys in their service. And as a result, we have a really substantial body of literature that tells us that UN peacekeeping operations bear a common stamp. They look very much like each other, despite their sort of different contexts in which they're deployed. And they also have certain common institutional features. But we very rarely treat them as a system of operations. We very rarely consider them as the systemic properties of those operations. We often consider them as discrete missions, or if we're evaluating them in the aggregate, we tend to look at whether in the aggregate, for instance, they succeed or fail, or whether in the aggregate they can or they can't implement their mandates. But if we right here can look around the world and think about how the Security Council is doing one thing, for instance, in Syria, and another thing, for instance, in Haiti, then so too can the parties to conflict. And the sort of big question that motivates the book as a result is the idea that the UN's behavior anywhere, as a result, could inform combatants' decisions everywhere. What the UN does in one place could inform what combatants in conflict cases do in other places. And as a result, the UN's failures anywhere could shape its ability to secure peace everywhere. If the UN fails to keep the peace or to protect people in one place, that may have very real effects on the way combatants or civilians in other places perceive the UN's potential ability to shape the end of their conflict or to help them secure a peace. And so the question that we have to ask is, why is UN peacekeeping desirable if combatants think it can't keep the peace? Now, we have something like 14 or 16 omnibus studies right now that tell us that peacekeeping is a very successful tool. It's very good at upholding peace agreements and at doing things like preventing backsliding into war and at preventing refugee flows from migrating cross borders or conflict from bleeding across borders. But we also know that the average person, if you ask them whether or not UN peacekeeping works, will say no, right? Because the failures, and it's about 1 in every 4 cases, present an outsized picture of what the UN is doing in the world. They're the vivid examples, they're the immediate examples, and understandably, because they still matter. But as a result, we have to ask, what does a perception of failure give to combatants? What do they think about UN peacekeeping if, in fact, they too might look around the world and see primarily failure? And that's the central question that motivates the book. Why is UN peacekeeping desirable if combatants think it can't keep the peace? Why does UN peacekeeping remain a desirable part of peace processes, even when and where its reputation frames it as an ineffective measure of protection for civilian populations and warring populations alike? Now, this is an empirical and a theoretical problem in the world. It's an empirical problem because there are about 80,000 peacekeepers worldwide in different missions. This is more troops than anyone else has in conflict zones. There are more UN peacekeepers in conflict zones than there are any other military actor worldwide. There are more UN peacekeepers worldwide than there are anything but US soldiers. So only the US military has a larger scale and scope of deployment than UN peacekeepers. So we have a system of interventions, and we empirically should want to know what the sort of systemic properties of that is. It's also a theoretical problem because underpinning a lot of work on UN peacekeeping is this credible commitment model of UN peacekeeping, where what peacekeepers are doing is solving a security problem. They're arriving to help alleviate security dilemmas. And in both cases, what we find is we have to interrogate these claims and investigate what they tell us about peacekeeping if we don't think that peacekeeping is universally perceived as being successful. So UN peacekeeping and peacemaking, I contend, are social and systemic processes. Combatants in one case can look around the world and observe the UN's behavior in other cases. The credible commitment theories of war termination argue that peacekeepers solve problems that are related to mistrust and security dilemmas. Now, if this is the way that peacekeeping works, then peacekeeping has to be effective, certainly, but it also has to be known to be effective. And we know that's not always the perception. So what can we learn from cases where peace process participants can't be sure peacekeeping success is guaranteed, or where they think peacekeeping failures are likely? What do combatants learn from cases where the UN fails? And why do they continue to seek the services of what they believe to be a failed, flawed guarantor? Now, the book is anchored in interviews and archival work in process-traced peace negotiations of Rwanda from 1990 to 1994 and Guatemala from 1989 to 1996. And it makes two key contentions. The first is that peace operations worldwide are a social system. By this, I mean that the UN's central role in peacemaking and peacekeeping worldwide means peace operations have structural consequences. In the same way they're marked by a common stamp, they too can bring a common set of attributes to conflict cases worldwide and to negotiation processes worldwide. And accordingly, what the UN does in one place can shift strategies, outcomes, and options available to parties to conflict in other places. The second key contention that the book makes is about the alternative benefits of negotiation with the UN on the ground. Even when they have very little faith in peacekeepers' ability to uphold their peace agreements, warring parties turn to the UN because its presence in negotiation processes enables unique tactical, material, and symbolic benefits that have very little to do with the end of fighting. They may have very little to do with peace. Some parties to conflict might in fact want peace, but some might want other things that only the international community can bring. And by tactical benefits, I mean, for example, time to regroup and rearm while they're at the negotiating table away from the battlefield, or the elevation of particular factions of rebel groups, for instance. By material benefits, I mean, certainly things like straight economic infusions of cash into local economies, but also things like state building and refugee resettlement that parties moving out of conflict may not be able to do on their own. And by symbolic benefits, I mean things like legitimacy. Sitting down with the UN is a very good way to become legitimate political actors, to certify that your intentions in the post-conflict space are benign or good, that you're not just a group of men who kill people in the bush, for instance. And all of those things are equally available from guarantors that you don't think can actually bring you peace. And so warring parties who negotiate with the UN's assistance after peacekeeping failures may do so because negotiation affords them these benefits, even when they're neither invested in peace nor convinced the UN can help them achieve it. And I make this argument with two process-traced peace negotiations, The first of these is the Rwandan negotiation, the Arusha peace process from 1990 to 1994. Now, famously, the UN peacekeeping mission to Rwanda, UNAMIR, is authorized in the immediate aftermath of the UN and US's massive failures in Somalia. And there's a good set of arguments about how that failure shapes the sort of very nature of the Rwandan peacekeeping mission. It's also the case that in the immediate aftermath of the genocide, the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the rebel group in the Rwandan Civil War that ultimately ends the genocide and is till this day the sort of ruling party of Rwanda, the RPF invites the United Nations back for a second UN peacekeeping mission. And this is a real set of puzzles with the best evidence in the world that the UN would not protect them, right? With the best evidence in the world that the UN would not protect Rwandans or help them bring peace, the RPF invites the UN back. And so in that sense, the Rwandan case is a necessary case for assessing the long-term and across-case effects of intervention. We know what the consequences of failure are in shaping the nature of the UN's intervention in Rwanda. We also need to know, as a result, what the sort of effects of failure are in shaping the Rwandan peace process itself and in shaping the invitation that the RPF issues back to the United Nations after the genocide. So what are the effects of other peacekeeping failures in Rwanda? How did the UN's failures elsewhere shape the course of negotiations? And what effect, if any, did the UN's past performance have on the Rwandan peace process? How did peacekeeping failures in Somalia and also in Burundi, which is sort of less spoken of in policy discussions, but happens at the same time, how did they condition the course of the conflict in the crucial months between the signing of the Arusha Accords and the genocide? A period of months that's actually still one of negotiation and implementation. So what led the RPF to invite a second UN peace operation into Rwanda following the cataclysmic failure of the first mission? Now, I find that parties to conflict had really diverse motives for seeking out the UN's involvement and had largely negative perceptions of the UN even before the peace process began. And these were actually perceptions of the UN that were anchored in the UN's role as the decolonization authority in Rwanda in the 1960s. And this is not something that I had thought to ask about before I went out to do interviews. But for example, this is sort of emblematic of one of the interviews that I did. And this is an interview with the liaison between the political and military wings of the RPF during the Arusha negotiations. And he said, "Since I was born, I have been living on the frustration of the UN. All of our parents, they had hope in the UN, but as I got older, even they became frustrated. Twice in my life, I have been frustrated with the UN. The whole of my life has been a frustration with the UN." And this isn't necessarily something that I need to ask for because, like many scholars of peacekeeping, the world sort of begins in 1989 when the Cold War ends and there's this flurry of UN peacekeeping operations because of the sort of new amount of agreement between the US and Russia. But in fact, for people, and for particularly these rebel movements in the 1990s, the sort of early and lasting experience of the UN begins at decolonization. And in that sense, the perception of the UN is already quite negative. And in that context, this becomes even more of a question. What do you want from the UN if you don't think the UN is there necessarily to help you? Okay. And I find that the material and symbolic benefits of negotiating with the UN on the ground, in particular, the idea of demobilization, assistance for demobilization and refugee resettlement and legitimacy drive this desire. So the international community's unique ability to assist in demobilization and refugee resettlement and to confer legitimacy on political groups are important dimensions of the negotiations. They're important reasons to have the UN on the ground. The parties to the conflict had a really mixed picture of the UN's efficacy as a guarantor at the start of negotiations, and they often held on to earlier unfavorable impressions from the decolonization period. But despite the UN's massive failures and despite these negative perceptions in the genocide, the RPF returned to seek the UN's help after the genocide because they required state-building, refugee resettlement, and legitimacy conferring capabilities. And security goals were largely secondary to this decision. as a sort of illustrative example, it turns out that the UNHCR's ability to manage post-conflict refugee resettlement is central to the RPF's decision to ask for UN assistance after the genocide. And the UN's presence in post-war Rwanda basically serves as a talisman for the RPF against accusations that they're waging a second war against the Hutu majority population in Rwanda after the genocide. This is an illustrative quote from one of the interviews that I did. This is an interview with Patrick Mazimhaka, the chief negotiator for the RPF. And he said, when the worst was over, then they, the UN, decided to come back. We asked them to. When the RPF defeated the government troops and the militias, it resulted in about 2.5 million refugees running into neighboring countries. Now, Rwanda had another 1 million refugees already out of a population of about 7 million. Look at the numbers. What did we have left? We had to face the construction of the country. We needed the UN to support repatriation programs and for confidence building against the people we had defeated, and for human rights to keep the government from revenge and to make the guys who were defeated feel secure. We had to make sure the peacekeepers were visible, to help with some resources to help the refugees back, to help us observe that the defeated forces were not just running away, but that they were also fighting back. And in that sense, we see the sort of real efforts to anchor the RPF's post-conflict legitimacy in the certification of the UN, that it's there to oversee these processes and that it's there to help confer this legitimacy on the party. So in this case, why is UN peacekeeping desirable, even if combatants think it can't keep the peace? Well, so the argument is that internationally led negotiations unfold in a shared strategic and social environment, and that the warring parties in Rwanda were attentive to the UN's behavior elsewhere, and they weren't confident in the UN's abilities as a security guarantor, but that they turned to the UN despite its failures because they were more interested in its ability to confer tactical, material, and symbolic benefits in the negotiation process than they really were in functions as a security guarantor. Turning now to the case of Guatemala, the Guatemalan negotiations unfold over the sort of long period of the sort of successive internationalized civil wars in Central America that bridged the end of the Cold War. The Guatemalan Civil War is the last ended of those cases, the last negotiated of those cases. And it is one that involves heavy international participation, much like the Rwandan case. Now, the question here is, how did the government of Guatemala and the URNG, the coalition of rebel groups that are fighting and negotiating with the government of Guatemala, assess the UN's performance as the guarantor of agreements elsewhere, especially given the concurrent peacekeeping success in neighboring El Salvador and the simultaneous failure in the Balkans? Unlike the Rwandan case, for example, parties to conflict in Guatemala could have looked next door at the peacekeeping mission in El Salvador and observed what was then the UN sort of banner success. The UN was doing quite well in El Salvador, right next door. But it was also, over the course of the negotiations, quite clear that the UN was massively struggling in the Balkans, with, much as in Rwanda, peacekeepers on the ground during acts of genocide and mass atrocity. Right? And so the question here is, what do the parties to conflict in Guatemala take from these cases? What kind of understanding of peacekeeping do they have, and what do they want from peacekeepers as a result? So how did these assessments influence the course of negotiations and the final agreement that emerged from their peace process? And I find that participants looked nearly exclusively at El Salvador to assess the contours and possibilities of the UN intervention. There's really no indication that they were concerned with what was happening in the Balkans, but that they perceived the Salvadoran example as a negative one, not as a banner of success, but as a case in which the parties to conflict gave up too much to the United Nations. Both sides believed their Salvadoran counterparts had given away too much during the negotiations, that this wasn't necessarily a success in peace, but a failure in negotiation on the parts of those parties. And they, as a result, advocated for a much smaller, weaker UN mission than the one that they saw in El Salvador. Now, the concern for the losses that the Salvadoran parties faced is apparent in 5 different dimensions of the Guatemalan negotiations, and I'm happy to talk about these more later. But the first is that in the warring parties' preference over the specific personnel who staffed the UN's negotiation team, they actively advocated for a much less experienced, much lower level ranking negotiating team than the Salvadorian participants to negotiation got. They actively advocated for a much less senior negotiator than they had at the outset of the negotiations. The government of Guatemala also advocated for a UN General Assembly mandate instead of a UN Security Council mandate, which is very unusual in the sort of annals of UN peacemaking. This is a much weaker set of oversight mechanisms and a much weaker set of tools. We see this sort of advocacy in the terms in which the Truth Commission was authorized. This is a set of processes in which the participants to conflict advocate for meaningfully less accountability, for no naming of names, for no possibility of prosecution. We see it in the attacks that MINAGUA, the mission to Guatemala, faced both before its deployment and immediately on its arrival in Guatemala. There's a set of military actions that's basically an effort to try and test the mission and to try and demonstrate its weakness. And we also see it in the government of Guatemala's move to appoint Spanish instead of UN personnel to reorganize its police and military forces. They look at what the international set of tools is in El Salvador, and they actively advocate for a set of Spanish interventions instead of UN interventions. And in each arena, one or both parties works to actively minimize the UN scope of authority in Guatemala, or to specifically alter a provision that had been successfully implemented in El Salvador, often with specific reference to the perceived losses that their counterparts had sustained in the El Salvadorian peace process. And we see this sort of explicitly. Everyone at the time knows that this is what's happening. So this is the Secretary General's first representative in Guatemala, Princess Vendrell, who says, the Guatemalan government felt all along that, at least I should say the Guatemalan authorities, that is the president, the armed forces, felt that they didn't want to suffer the fate, as they saw it, of their El Salvadorian counterparts, where they felt that the army had been reduced, had been purified, had been removed from a role in civil society, and so on and so forth. Therefore, we were always careful not to appear to be copying the El Salvadorian process. The RNG, on its side, also felt that the FMLN had gone too far in concessions. As it turned out, of course, we all knew eventually they would follow a similar path if they were going to reach an agreement at all. So anyway, the agreement is relatively similar. We see it again, for instance, this is the Secretary of the Presidency and the Chief of the Government's Peace Commission speaking at a talk about the peace process. Says the government of Guatemala is very worried about the concessions given to the FMLN by the Salvadorian government, because the URNG would like to have the same concessions given to them here. Conde finally concluded that he hopes the URNG does not use the peace in El Salvador in order to lengthen the process and demand other concessions. So this is a dynamic that all of the participants are conscious of at the time and actively trying to manage and negotiate. And so the learning that we see from the success in El Salvador is actually about weakening the peace. It's about producing a weaker agreement and a weaker set of enforcement mechanisms. So both sides actively pursued UN intervention for the symbolic, material, and tactical benefits it brought to the negotiation process, even as specifically the government of Guatemala actively sought to minimize the UN's role as a security guarantor to the peace process. Now, influential, credible commitment theories of peacekeeping predict that the UN success in El Salvador should actually enhance the Guatemalan parties to conflict, their confidence in the UN as the guarantor, but that's not what we see happening. Even though most accounts of UN peacekeeping in Guatemala frame the mission as a success, what we actually see is that the UN's success in El Salvador first prolonged the war in Guatemala and then produced a weaker agreement, a degraded capacity to enforce the peace, and inferior human rights outcomes for the Guatemalan domestic public. And so what we see here is that the social nature of UN's peacekeeping and peacemaking, combatants' ability to look at the world and see what the UN is doing elsewhere, can actually change the nature of the domestic peace, can actually change the nature of the negotiation process. Now, there are two sets of implications, I think, from the argument that I want to highlight here. The first is for scholars of peace operations, and the second is for policymakers and practitioners. Now, for scholars of peace operations, I think the argument that I've advanced here should really make us reconsider the stark conception of individual conflicts as independent units, and should really make us think about the social interaction of missions, the way these missions are actually responsive to one another, and the way these peace processes are actually responsive to one another as a result of the UN's central role in peacekeeping and peacemaking worldwide. And it should also, I think, make us reconsider the sort of easy historicization of peace operations as two periods bisected by the end of the Cold War, where in fact what we're seeing is a long institutional inheritance of the UN's role in conflict countries that often dates to their independence. Now, for policymakers and practitioners, I think that the book joins an ongoing debate about the future of peace operations, with more evidence in favor of peacemaking as a locally grounded political process, not as something that's most successful or most desirable as an externally engineered military undertaking. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And we'll give the floor now to Dana for her comments.
Thank you very much, Anjali, for this talk and for writing such a fascinating book. I really think it makes some really important contributions to our understanding of peacekeeping, to the literature, and as you highlighted, also to questions that practitioners face. And it also is a really pleasant read, and it's really thoroughly researched, so I'd highly recommend it. I enjoyed reading it. Maybe just to start off in a way with a puzzle at the title, which is very catchy, in a way that you managed to, right from the outset, problematize the main way in which peacekeeping has been approached in so much of literature so far, namely, as you said, as an answer to the credible commitment problem. So you rightfully ask, what about these incredible commitments? So what if, to quote you, what demonstrably incredible failing peacekeepers might provide to conflict parties? And this, when I was reading it, I was like, this is a very good question. I can't believe it hasn't been, thought of this thoroughly yet. And with this, you mentioned also the whole chapter on methodology, with a really neat methodology that sets out to both theory test existing theories of the credible commitment problem and security guarantees as explanations for peacekeeping, and sort of theory build this other theory which you built, which is about, well, if conflict parties actually do not assume that the UN can offer these security guarantees that they seek, that we would expect them to seek according to the more classic understanding of war termination, then why do they invite the UN to get involved? And you do this really in these two cases with a really rich process tracing, and that makes many contributions, I think, to the understanding of these two cases. But also, I think, is a really nice example for some of the things that we know in general about peace negotiations, such as that actually on all sides there are usually the sort of these ideal types of the desperate negotiator, the hardliners, the spoilers, and you sort of really line that out in these two cases, which is really rich. And then one kind of side note that I noticed as I was reading also what sources you use, that you do interviews, you have a lot of material that you work with from documents, that you also made use of documentation sort of collected for transitional justice purposes, for Truth Commission purposes from the ICTR for Rwanda. And I just thought, since we have colleagues working on archives and on dealing with the past at SwissPeace as well, that this is kind of an interesting link, how work done for these purposes can later also contribute to scholarship and to advancing even theory on our understanding of peace and conflict. And so you make two explicit arguments in the book, which you've mentioned, of course, here, that there is a shared social context to these peace operations. And as a consequence, parties seek UN involvement for many reasons, seeking benefits possibly beyond just peace. And so they are, as they seek these benefits, observing what the UN is doing and has done elsewhere. And I'll pose a couple of questions, like a couple of comments that I'm curious to hear more about. Your use of sort of the choice of calling this a social system. That was quite intriguing to me. You do refer to other sort of epistemological literature around how we would understand this phenomenon. But it made me think, is this unique to the UN? Does this hold outside the UN as well? Because there are, as you rightly say, of course, other peacekeeping actors in the world, increasingly so. Is there such a social system evolving around the African Union, for example? Or could particular great powers or former colonial powers have their own social systems from which conflict parties would learn. And of course, you mentioned this in the two cases, that both Guatemala and Rwanda had heavy involvement of the Permanent Five members and of the regional organizations, so African Union and Organization of American States, in these negotiation processes. So if you could say a little bit more about that, that would be really interesting. Because particularly in the sort of literature around kind of newer actors in the peace building field, also in the literature around how certain norms get carried into peacemaking and peacekeeping endeavors, would this concept of the social system help us understand that as well? For example, China's role. Maybe this is taken far, but I was wondering if you had thoughts on this. And then apart from these like direct contributions to sort of adding a new theory for understanding why combatants would actually seek peacekeeping, which is really well done and thought-provoking, I think. There's also interesting insights in the book for, as you mentioned, for scholarship and practice. And I think that you make this kind of side note at some point in the book, which links these two, which is actually that while scholarship around peacekeeping has shown consistently and quite seems to be a pretty solid finding across studies that peacekeeping works. We can go into what success means, but on the whole, by most measures of success, it works. And yet it is widely believed not to work, as you pointed out in the talk. And so this is really why perceptions matter so much. And I think I really appreciate that about the process tracing, where you show evidence of how actors perceived the UN. And that, of course, these past experiences, it hinges on how they interpret these past experiences. So there is no such thing actually as objective success or failure. But it's about how sort of actors come to blame the UN or other actors for what has happened. And it also actually highlights really importantly that we shouldn't take for granted that local and international actors would expect the same things from peacekeeping. And that also made me think that maybe we as scholars should also take that seriously and think about how we come to expect certain things from peacekeeping and how we come up with certain definitions of success and failure. So this is really thought-provoking. And then in terms of the substance, you show that combatants might want different things out of peacekeeping. You highlighted this, the tactical, material, and symbolic benefits that they might get or out of bargaining with the UN. And that is a very convincing argument, I found. And you also show that some of these actors or some parts of some of these, along these conflict lines, there are parties that want peace and these other things, and there are parties that might not actually want peace. They might want escalations, for example, in the Rwandan case. And the question that came to my mind is a little bit, what are the actors in these cases, or in general, perhaps at headquarter level, are the UN actors aware of this? Is this a story where the UN is being played for these benefits, or are they facilitating this in some way, maybe inadvertently or actually actively? Is there an incentivizing dynamic here? Because you had the quote in the talk about the UN's presence in post-war Rwanda as a talisman against accusations that the RPF was waging a second war against the Hutu majority. So did you find anything around that in your research? And it made me think again also about the sort of supply and demand side. You show how combatants might want different things out of the UN, such as symbolic, material, etc. benefits. But truly, there's also different actors, maybe even within the UN or in the international community, willing to supply these things or not. And in the Guatemalan case, you mentioned how, for example, civil society actors involved in the negotiations also were very important in driving this. So if you could say a bit more about the supply-demand thing side of the argument. And then you mentioned your contribution to scholarship, which is precisely that we have a bit of an issue when we isolate peacekeeping cases in many statistical studies into discrete instances, because of course actors learn and there are ways in statistical studies to account for this. But I think your book shows really nicely that can only go that far, because as you said, that you were yourself surprised in the interviews to find that many Rwandan interlocutors remembered or identified the UN with the colonial period, and that I think it really is an important contribution to make us rethink this sort of slicing of cases into pre-negotiation phase, negotiation phase, agreement, and the way that is often done. That might actually conceal quite a lot of dynamics. And again, this, for area studies people, this will not be surprising that the colonial period and its legacies loom large, but actually, sadly, for IR and politics scholars, I think it's very, very important to keep that in mind. So it makes, in that sense, I think, a really important contribution to this really big and growing peacekeeping literature, which is so much focused on statistical methods and sort of isolating variables, as you've said. And it comes at a point where I think some other scholars are also trying to link peacekeeping more to IR theory, to sort of world political dynamics. There was a recent edited volume on UN peace operations and international relations. And I was thinking of our former colleague Sarah Hellmüller's work on world politics. So this is really timely and I think important. And then the book ends, and I'll end as well, with really important questions about the future of peacekeeping. Because as you say, these are older cases. They are cases that were important because they shaped UN peacekeeping and also the way combatants look at what they might expect from the UN. But at the same time, a lot has changed. And so if the overall point that you make, which I think is really convincing, that peace and security are not the only motives that combatants seek from the UN, if this point stands, but the specific expectations about what parties what they might expect from the UN has changed because mandates have changed, and there's, as you say, peacekeeping is makes much more active use of counterinsurgency tactics, and there's a protection of civilians usually in the mandate. So have the other expectations, the material, symbolic, and tactical gains that combatants might expect from the UN change too? So for example, large state building operations, the way we saw them in the 90s, 2000s are so much less likely to be approved today. What trends do we see on that side of the equation, and how does this link to sort of some work that has come out about how the UN might, again, either inadvertently or not, it's unclear, be promoting authoritarian tendencies in some post-conflict states. These are some of my thoughts. Thank you again for the talk and for the book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I hope many others in the room will do so too.
Thank you, Dana. And so now the floor is open for your questions, and not all questions have to be formulated in terms of questions. They can also be comments or things that made you think of. Well, we leave people some time to think about and reflect their actions. Maybe actually, Professor Dayal, you would like to take some time first to get back to Dana, who also raised a lot of questions that I guess you are willing to answer.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for your questions and your comments. I really appreciate them. And you raise a lot of really, I think, important questions about the text, ones that I'm still sitting with in many ways as well myself. I can take them in order. The first is your question about the choice of calling this a social system, and whether or not this applies to, say, the African Union or to former colonial powers, especially as the number of peacekeepers and peacemakers worldwide increases, and whether the concept of a social system helps us explain, say, China's behavior vis-a-vis peacekeeping and peacemaking. Now, the choice of calling this a social system turns out to have made nobody happy in this process, because reviewers, for instance, I had 3 wonderful anonymous reviewers who are from very different epistemological traditions, clearly. And one of them objected to the use of the word system, and the other one objected to the use of the word social. And I think that shows us something about the way we understand the world and about the way scholarship is vis-a-vis peacekeeping right now. The objection to calling it a social system was that I demonstrate a very thin conception of social. I say social in the sense of these units interact with each other meaningfully. The objection to systemic was that it's too strong of a term for what is inherently a weak set of institutions. And in that sense, my argument was basically that even a thin conception of social interaction is enough to make us question the methodologically individualist assumption that is built into most quantitative work. That isn't because scholars working in this tradition don't understand that that's what's happening. It's because methodologically, that's the default assumption. It is the way we assume units are independent, and we have to correct for the idea that they're not. But the sort of point that I was trying to make here is that we can't assume that they're independent and correct for the fact that they're not, because in fact, at every level, we see that this, even a thin conception of social behavior, can undermine the assumption of individual units that are not responsive to one another. And in that sense, even a weak set of institutions can be systemic, right? Something, it doesn't have to be the case. And this is something that we see, for instance, in the constructivist scholarship on the UN Security Council. An institution doesn't need to be, doesn't need to have enforcement capability to be authoritative. And the sort of way in which that enforcement capability works depends a lot on the place and depends a lot on the population receiving the set of interventions as well. Now, that with all of that on the table, I do think this applies to other sets of multilateral actors, and for sure to other sort of like former colonial powers and to powers like China. I think we are more easy and more willing and sort of reflexively able to make the set of determinations about former colonial powers or about, say, great powers. It's very easy to talk about the systemic properties of US troop deployment, right? We can talk about the way what the US does in Iraq shapes reactions to Afghanistan quite easily, right? We can talk about the way what China does in Hong Kong shapes decisions made in Taiwan, for instance. And that to me shows us, right, that this set of behaviors must exist for multilateral actors as well, because we're so comfortable saying it about other kinds of intervening actors. Now, it's certainly the case, for instance, that the African Union, this dynamic must be happening as well. It's not something that I looked at, but the African Union is deeply, or the precursor to the African Union is deeply involved in the initial stages of the Rwandan negotiation. It's certainly the case that the parties prefer a more international set of bodies. They don't necessarily want the African Union. They want the better resourced, larger organization out of the gate. And so certainly this dynamic is taking place as well. The second set of questions that you had were about whether or not the UN actors were aware of this dynamic, whether they're being played, right? And related to that, the question of the supply and demand issue, how different actors are differently motivated. They want a different diversity of things, both within and the UN system and on the demand side. I for sure think that UN actors are aware of this. They know this dynamic is happening. They know in some cases they're being played and there's no way out of this trap. But also, as we know, like not per se from my work, but from the work of scholars like Céline Audissier, right? They find they are unable to do different things, even when they're aware of the problem at hand, right? There's a particular kind, or if we think of like Martha Fenimore and Michael Barnett's work, the sort of logic of organizational behavior and the sort of intellectual frames that they might bring might prevent them from actually doing something meaningfully about the fact that they know they're being played. It's also the case that sometimes they know and there isn't a better answer. And I think that we see this most clearly, we see this quite clearly in contemporary cases, right? So if we think, and this speaks to your last question about how expectations of the UN have changed, but even, and so what does that tell us if this dynamic obtains still? If we think about like today in Tigray or today in Syria, right? Even with no UN mission on the ground, right? There is this incredible problem of cooperation with the state to distribute aid or even to document human rights abuses or any of those things. We had just in the news day before yesterday, right? Human rights reporters having to collaborate with the Ethiopian government's newly created human rights arm to produce the watchdog report in Tigray. For sure, the UN actors involved in that process know there is a problem, right? Know that their presence on the ground is being used to certify something that is not correct, but are explicitly saying there is really no way out of this trap for us because we're not going to get access to this place unless we go with the Ethiopian government. And I think we see that dynamic as well in the sort of like, case of Syria, right? So there is an argument, and I'm clearly not the first person to make this argument, that the UN is serving as the implementing arm of the Syrian government in some places because of the way it distributes aid and because of its reliance on the Syrian government's consent to operate. And what we see there is the same dynamic, right? Where in order to function, the legitimacy granting presence of the UN is doing something else as well. And in that sense, I think there are both like these organizational pathologies, there are both these intellectual traps that prevent the UN from working more nimbly and from like counteracting this. And there are real logics of action that make it very hard to escape this set of processes. And in both cases, I do think UN actors are aware of it. Sometimes they are not aware of it enough to do something different, like working at a more local level. Sometimes they find that there is no way out of it. I don't know if that answers your question or not about that.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And the last question is, if parties' expectations of the UN changed, have the other parties' expectations changed as well? And what about the diversity of, what about this link to UN and authoritarianism? I think as these missions have changed, as you note, today they're overwhelmingly involved in civilian protection. One thing that the book does not do is look beyond the elite negotiating level. And that's largely because the UN itself, international actors privilege this elite level of negotiation at the expense of local level conflicts for sure. But what that does is it often like shuts out the expectations of civil society, shuts out the expectations of other actors who are not present at the negotiating table. One thing that we see repeatedly, one thing that came up when I interviewed people involved in staffing peacekeeping operations, is that no matter what the mandate says, civilians expect protection from the United Nations. And that expectation is not something that shows up in this book, but is certainly growing and is certainly the case in all places where the UN is present. And that expectation is also something that we can see sour in meaningful ways when the UN does destructive things to the local population. When people are, when people are asked what they want from the UN in other places, they will often say protection. If you look at civil society in Haiti, for instance, though, right, that's the opposite condition, where in the presence of sexual abuse and exploitation, in the presence of cover-ups for public health crises that the UN has instigated, civil society actors do not want the UN present. And so we see this sort of dynamic relationship between what the UN does and what people want, I think. I don't know if that answered your questions or not.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah.